Hello, good evening, or good day, wherever you may be. My name is Mike Scott. I'm from Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford, and I'm also with Georgetown University. Thank you for joining us tonight or this afternoon for a lecture which is going to be given by Dr. Bonnie Lander Johnson from Cambridge University, and she'll be talking about Shakespeare and Eden, Botanical Ornament and the Book of Nature in Cymbeline. This talk is the 10th in the series, a Christian Shakespeare ? But the first that we've tried through Zoom technology. The series began in October 2019. It looks at the influence of Elizabethan and Jacobean Christian environment on the writings of William Shakespeare. It's part of a larger project, The Future of the Humanities, which is promoted and supported by the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford, and by Georgetown University in conjunction with their Humanities initiative. The aim of the project is to explore through a series of high-profile lectures, talks, conferences, seminars, and symposium, the place of the humanities in continuing to develop an understanding of human life, dignity, equality, and culture. The structure for tonight is that we will first hear a talk from Bonnie. This will last for approximately 20 minutes. Then there will be a period for questions and answers. And this puts it over to you to ask your questions. You can do this by using your Q&A button, and you can start to do this immediately that I finished and Bonnie has started talking. If you've got a question, if you want to put through, please press your Q&A button. Your name will come up automatically. Type up your question, and that question will come to me after the talk so that I can give your question to Bonnie. After Bonnie's finished, or after we've finished answering the questions, I'll draw the session to an end so that we can conclude no later than 9 p.m. BST or 4 p.m. EST. So I've got welcome to Bonnie. Bonnie read for her DPhil at Oxford and is now a member of the English faculty and of Newnham College at the University of Cambridge. She's the author of Chastity in Early Stuart Literature and Culture with Cambridge University Press, and editor of Blood Matters with University of Pennsylvania Press. She's currently editing the Cambridge Handbook of Literature and Plants and completing a monograph on Shakespeare's botany and belief. She's also editing a multi-volume series of prose fiction by Catholic women. And I'm absolutely delighted to say welcome to you, Bonnie, and thank you very much for coming tonight through the technology and for speaking to us. So, Bonnie, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and hi, everybody. So we're talking about Shakespeare's Cymbeline, and in this play, we're given one of Shakespeare's numerous garden scenes. Like the garden scene in Richard II and in Romeo and Juliet, this scene in Cymbeline is at once very localized and very emblematic. In it, we meet the Queen, who's a kind of wicked stepmother figure. She's a sort of caricature from a fairy tale, although in this scene, actually, she's the most sort of fleshed out. She's in her garden and she's gathering plants with her women. She's giving them instructions on how to pick the plants, quite professionalized instructions. And then her hired tutor, a medical man called Cornelius, arrives, and he and the Queen have a debate about whether or not he's going to give her the particular kind of training that she's requested from him. So we're told that Cornelius has already trained the Queen in how to make healing medicine, but now she wants him to teach her how to make deadly poisons, and he quite rightly suspects her of ill intentions, because of course she wants to go and poison the heroine Imogen. So this exchange between them in the garden is a kind of power tussle between a royal woman with no formal medical training, but a lot of social status, and a man with a lot of institutional training and a claim to authority above hers on the grounds of his gender and intellectual pedigree, but who is nonetheless subordinate to her as his monarch. And in this scene, he also claims a moral status over the queen, one that relates directly to their respective knowledge of plants. So there is a lot going on in the scene, but primarily it's lifted directly from the exchange between the two of them. It's lifted directly from a very Jacobean context in which two people are arguing over the proper uses of plants and the proper distribution of knowledge about plants' essential virtues and functions. So the scene is asking, what kind of knowledge is botanical knowledge? Is it theological, medical, domestic, political? Who is allowed access to this knowledge and who can be trusted to use it well? In a similar way, I think, to the garden scene in Romeo and Juliet, we see the friar there meditating on the essential qualities of plants. Here in Cymbeline's garden scene, we even get some very specific uses of emerging Jacobean technology for the way that plants' inner virtues were thought to be imprinted on their exterior, which was part of the doctrine of signatures. So the garden scene belongs to a category of Shakespearean plant imagery that we might designate as like natural philosophy. The scene is concerned with local knowledge systems that were both theological and proto-scientific. Then there's a second category of botanical knowledge in this play, and these are the various domestic scenes in which Imogen is compared to plants through praise, sometimes quite conventional Petrarchan descriptions of her skin as lilies or her sweet breath as eglantine, but also some more ritualized comparisons such as those in her funerary rites. Also in some of these scenes, Imogen's own virtue is established through her knowledge of plants. Again, I think these are scenes that we see elsewhere. Perdita and Ophelia are the most well-known examples of characters who offer specific plant species as gifts to other people, plants that symbolize or reflect the receiver's external or internal qualities. And these scenes, although they might appear quite decorative in function, they are in fact, like the garden scene, moments that depict people who are trying to decipher the interior qualities of plants through their exterior signs. They're reaching for the essential truths and meanings in plants. But there's also something quite ritualistic about these, this second category of scenes too. They're moments that enact inquiry into the meaning in the created world in ways that are quite ceremonial. Okay, so then there's a third category of plant imagery in Cymbeline, which includes a series of prophetic descriptions of the main characters as plants. Now, one of these images is part of the actual prophecy about the king as a tree to whom all of his children or branches will soon return. But we also get two descriptions of Imogen herself as a tree or a vine upon the tree that is her husband. Now, these prophetic tree images featured very prominently in scholarship from the mid-20th century that read this play as a Christological narrative in which Imogen is a Christ figure who undergoes the passion and crucifixion and whose ultimate resurrection and marriage is depicted through this tree imagery as a union of Christ and the church. So this scholarship by people like Peggy Simmons, Arthur Kirsch, Robin Moffat, even Northrop Frye, has almost entirely fallen out of quotation. So part of what I'm trying to do in my current work is to recuperate some of these older Christological readings in light of more recent historicist work on early modern botany as the area of natural philosophy in which we most clearly see modern proto-scientific empiricism emerging out of medieval conceptions of the created world as a series of allegories for divine truths that were also and already revealed in scripture, doctrine, and tradition, or what we might call the book of nature. So my favorite description of this medieval view of incarnate nature comes from Sarah Beckwith, and I'm going to read it to you. All of humankind strove to recognize, cultivate, and restore the likeness to their creator that was always already there. These developments of the implications of the incarnation are then made on the basis of a Neoplatonizing Augustinianism, which imagined the entire visible world as bearing the traces or vestigia of God. Christ's willingness to be incarnated, his embodiment, is crucial because it is only this condescension to the flesh which will allow all other images to signify. It's only his incarnation which, by symbolizing and embodying the union of image and exemplar, establishes for fallen man the possibility of a knowledge of God through his vestiges in nature. The world then, as an image of God, is potent with signification. The material world becomes a text which we may interpret, scrutinize, allegorize, and investigate for the way that it points to its exemplar and author, God. Okay. So this conception of the created world changed completely throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And early modern literary scholars are quite familiar with the later 17th century development of reformed thought about the created world as something that was made by God, but no longer bore the incarnate reality of God. Because we see this problem at work in metaphysical poetry, especially that of Marvell, Vaughan, and Poulter, for instance. This emptying of the incarnate from creation was a major source of concern for reformed botanists, poets, and exegetes. And so, in fact, as the 17th century developed, we see this turn back to a search for God in nature. But by then, the intellectual and disciplinary landscape had changed so much that attempts to re-sacralize the ornamental world of plants was done in a very reformed way. It is in this later 17th century moment that we find the project of Edenic retrieval, the belief that godly gardening practices, amongst other things, could actually literally restore Earth to Eden. Even the very rational John Donne held this view for a while. And among botanists, we see it expressed most by people like Neremiah Grew and John Parkinson. Now, for this later 17th century historical context, we have this really rich and very current, lively field of scholarship by Peter Harrison, Robert Watson, Leah Knight, Barbara Bushnell, Alex Cooper, others as well. This scholarship describes the intellectual processes by which the medieval understanding of incarnate nature began to come under pressure from the sheer quantity of new natural objects that were circulating in the age of discovery, producing an expanded lexicon of signs for which the medieval allegorical associations were now totally lacking. And a disturbing implication of this development was that the things of nature bore no universal God-given significance anymore. And in reaction against this potential void of meaning, later 17th century natural philosophers actually began to take on a kind of priestly role. They were priests for whom the garden became a living pharmacopoeia and a kind of surrogate Bible as well. But crucially, all of these changes belonged to the late 17th century. This is the sort of narrative that's dominating scholarship of early modern botany at the moment, but it is a rather later narrative. And sometimes this narrative is read back onto Shakespeare. But in fact, in the last decades of the 16th century, the botanical works being printed in Shakespeare's London tell quite a different story. In the field of 16th century botany in particular, William Turner was the most famous British herbalist. John Gerard was also publishing at this time, but his reputation was a bit unsteady because of his notorious plagiarism. So in the middle of the century, Turner wrote the first book of botany in English that is recognizably empiricist, but he also wrote a number of reformed theological tracts, one of which is The Hunting and Finding of the Romish Fox. So as well as being a kind of cool-headed botanical field researcher, he was also a bit of a firebrand anti-papist. Another tract printed in the years that Shakespeare was working in London is an English translation of an early 16th century Catholic Dutch work on biblical plants. And in its Englishing of the original, the translation alters both the language and the doctrine. So the English version is an explicitly reformed text, but it nonetheless still belongs to an older intellectual tradition to which the original belonged. Okay, besides these two key encyclopedic botanical texts, there's also a number of mid-16th century printed works of creation theology. And I've only begun to do a full bibliographic survey of works printed between 1530 and 1590, but there are actually quite a lot of tracts that are not included in current histories of botany. These works of creation theology identify themselves as general works of natural philosophy that are separate from what they call the new particular or applied branches of physics and botany. So although they claim not to be works of applied botany, they are nonetheless very interested in plants. These creation tracts draw heavily on patristic writers, Augustine, Basil, Ambrose, and some of them even instruct readers not to be so scrupulous or superstitious, those are their words, as to disregard patristic and even medieval thought on creation. So these works are doctrinally very moderate, as indeed was most Henrician theology. However, I think in these tracts, we do see a submerged conflict at work regarding divine immanence in matter, through assertions that on the one hand, God made creatures, but is himself separate from those creatures. And on the other hand, man is called to find God's mark or God's own mysterious presence in the essential and secret virtues contained in plants. Also, at various points, the measured voice of these tracts gives way to quite vociferous anti-papal injunctions, and this almost always happens over the question of idolatry. So what I think is happening in these texts is that the writers are advancing moderate and one might say almost quite Catholic and unreformed descriptions of creation. So the writers occasionally feel obligated to ensure that readers, make sure that their readers know that they are stopping short of idolatry. And I think of pertinence here is one of the articles in the 39 Articles of Faith from 1571, which is the article on idolatry. It says that the things which were the good creatures of God before, as trees or stones, when they be once altered and fashioned into images to be worshipped, become abomination, a temptation unto the souls of men, and a snare for the feet of the unwise. So 16th century iconoclasm usually describes the evil of gold, brass, silver. So we can sometimes forget, I think, that objects in nature, like plants, were themselves becoming suspicious to iconoclasts. Alison Shell and Alexandra Walsham have both shown that in the 16th century, popular devotions that were already embedded in the local landscape were becoming increasingly associated with Catholic and illiterate practice. For instance, the sheer quantity of Marian names for local flowers. Sometimes it appears like every single plant had a Marian name. So the vast majority of rural people, both Catholic and Reformed, simply assumed divine immanence in local landscapes, especially in plants. But these beliefs were being reinterpreted by learned botanical writers and theologians as idolatry. But the conflict here is that Reformed botanical writers themselves do nonetheless use language that describes divine immanence in creation and urges readers to search for God in plants. So what I see at work in these creation tracts is a desire to hold onto the medieval trust in God's immanence in creation. But that desire is being frustrated or pressured by the increased influence of iconoclasm among learned botanists. So we could say that the later 17th century narrative is one in which divine immanence has already been emptied from the created world and is being sought again through new forms of Edenic retrieval. But instead, in this 16th century moment, which is more pertinent to Shakespeare, we find that the medieval vision of an incarnate natural world is actually still possible, but is coming under the pressure of reform. Okay, so how does all of this help us with Cymbeline? As ever, you know, the obstacle with dealing with questions of doctrine in Shakespeare emerges from the fact that he was working in the popular theatre, a space from which explicit questions of doctrine had been removed. But I want to try and turn this obstacle into an opportunity by thinking about the theatre itself as actually uniquely able to explore late 16th century concerns over the desacralization of nature. Second only to liturgy, the theatre was the most prominent space in early modern, in which early modern people from every social group could experience an embodied performance that had, since the reform of biblical drama, been emptied of its sacramental reality. We know from anti-theatrical writing and from the work of Michael O'Connell and a host of other scholars that the theatre continued to be associated with the mass and with idolatrous practices, even after it had ceased to depict any explicit biblical or sacramental content. Biblical drama had been a form, a dramatic form, that encompassed the reality of divine immanence, because it used creation in the bodies and voices of human actors to reveal God's nature. So Shakespeare's theatre and its secularized content was potentially still able to signal divine immanence, even if only in a controversial sense, from the point of view of an anti-theatricalist. So all three of the categories of botanical imagery in Cymbeline, the proto-scientific, the ritualized, and the Christological or prophetic, have been emptied of their explicit Christology, because this is the theatre. But I want to suggest that the human instincts behind these scenes, instincts to find God or to find essential divine meaning in creation, are nonetheless being reinscribed within the drama. In fact, I'm playing with the idea that there's something sacramental in these emblematic and ritualized botanical moments. I'm playing with the idea that they enact the human search for sacramental meaning as something that's been diverted away from the liturgical context and instead towards the created world. Taken on their own, there appears nothing sacramental about these scenes at all, because they deal solely with nature. So they're neither reformed nor unreformed, but purely pagan. But if we read them within the context of changing theological approaches to plants, and this play's broader concern with Christology, then we could say that these scenes depict or even enact this re-sacralizing of nature. Okay, so I'm going to leave a question mark over that, because it's a question that I'm still grappling with myself, and I think we need to stop for questions. So I'm going to hand back to Mike.
Bonnie, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. You've gone through a huge amount of material there in a very short space of time. I had a question right at the beginning, asking what is the book reference for the Beckwith quotation that you mentioned?
Oh, it's her book, The Body of Christ. I have to pull it up. Will the title be enough? It's The Body of Christ. Yeah, I think it's Routledge. It's a great book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Thanks very much. I just wondered, Bonnie. I mean, you referred it back to Shakespeare, and obviously you're referring it back to Cymbeline. How about Richard II and the famous garden scene in Richard? Would you like to say something a bit about that? Yeah.
So I think all of the garden scenes actually fulfill similar functions. The scene in Cymbeline, I think, is particularly prominent because it sits in a play that contains so many other kinds of botanical knowledge as well. But taken on their own, certainly the garden scene in Richard II and in Romeo and Juliet are both doing similar work. And I've worked on both of those scenes. I would say also, by way of referencing the fact that my title talked about ornament and I didn't manage to fit that in, it's in the garden scene in Richard II that I have been thinking more about changing ideas of botanical ornamentation and the way that botanical ornamentation, as it emerges in the traditions of the hexaemeron, starts to describe the crucial role that art plays in mediating man's knowledge of incarnate nature. And I think we see that in a lot of these garden scenes, but especially in Richard II, the language that's used there has a highly emblematic quality. And so in the broader work from which this emerges, I actually read a lot of those garden scenes as though they were lifted from artworks, from tapestries and almanacs and other kinds of botanical art, rather than just proto-scientific botanical knowledge, as it were. Does that make sense?
Okay, thanks. Let me go to some of the for the questions. There's a question here from referring to Hannibal Hamer's book, I think it's called, The Bible and Shakespeare. About posthumous comment to Imogen, hang there like fruit my soul till the tree die, is an allusion to Genesis story. Do you think it's an allusion to the Genesis story of the fruit of the tree of knowledge?
Yeah, so the three prophetic tree images that I referred to, one is the prophecy about the king as a tree to which the children will return. And the other two describe Imogen, and that's one of them. That's the most prominent one. The other one is a bit more subdued, so it can be missed. It's when Imogen's two brothers, at the point at which they don't realize that they're her brothers, see her, and they talk about her as a tree in her grief, and they sort of say a kind of a prayer asking for the roots of her tree to dig deeper into the earth. So I think all of those three trees are actually doing a lot of Genesis work, but that final image where Imogen clings to Posthumus and he says, yeah, hang there like fruit, that is definitely at the core of the scholarship from the last century that read this play as a Christological narrative. It's a highly emblematic image that comes at a crucial point in the narrative to suggest that the union between them is a kind of marital realization of Christ's union with the church, and therefore fulfills the sort of passion and crucifixion trajectory that Imogen has gone through. Yeah, so yeah.
Okay, can I ask, can I just send a message through to Catherine? I'm actually losing some of the questions here, Catherine. They're disappearing from me. So I think I had a question from the question I've just asked came from Richard Vorgerman. I've got another question about the connections between these Christian images and pagan images, invoking the dangers of women with knowledge, especially the knowledge of plants, which in classical mythology seems related to magic. Do you see these Shakespearean themes as revisions of these pre-Christian classical images? That's come from Jasmine.
Yeah, the garden scene in Cymbeline with the Queen's request for knowledge is a tricky one, because it sort of stands separate from a lot of Shakespeare's other work with women and women's knowledge. I mean, we know from the comedies, right, he has a lot of great female characters who possess wonderful knowledge that is not dangerous. All's well that ends well, Rosalind in As You Like It. But this garden scene is so specific in the way that it depicts the Queen, specifically, and I use this scene a lot with students, because it actually looks like a scene that's kind of background noise, but when you follow their dialogue, and I like to read it alongside a chapter by Andrew Weir in his book on early modern medicine, Knowledge and Practice in Early Modern London. There's a whole chapter on remedies that outlines the key players in Elizabethan and Jacobean medical scene, and who had which kinds of knowledge and how they shared it and when they didn't and where the tensions were. And in fact, it maps so perfectly onto the dynamic between the Queen and her hired tutor in that scene. There is definitely something dangerous about her knowledge in this play, for sure. I mean, yeah. Cornelius has to go to devious ends to replace the poison that they're making, so that Imogen, when she takes it, is not killed. So oh, I suppose we could say, yeah, that there's a rewriting of classical implications there. But I think that the work of the Queen, the Queen's dangerous knowledge, is doing other things within the play itself. Thinking about other women and their knowledge of plants in other plays, I'm also interested in the fact that in Romeo and Juliet, the friar is shown to have quite a deep, interested knowledge in plants from a theological as well as a medical point of view. But there's an interesting moment when the nurse sort of recognizes how much the friar knows and says, I wish I had book learning like you. And this comes after she's given us the story about how she weaned Juliet in the garden with wormwood. And she actually encapsulates all the kind of common herbal medicine that women, illiterate women had. She knows about simples, single medicines that do specific things for specific illnesses, sort of unsophisticated, but internalized knowledge. They knew what the plant did, even though they couldn't read and they didn't read herbals. Whereas the Queen in Cymbeline is obviously a literate woman who can command a huge amount of knowledge, and it is dangerous in her hands. So I don't know, actually I think there's a lot to be said about the difference between literates and illiterates in botany and in Shakespeare. And, you know, in the medical world, everything that's being written is what's come down to us, and that's kind of where the rules are worked out. But we know by reading through the lines that there was a whole lot of common illiterate practice going on that was perfectly legitimate and accepted. And Shakespeare is actually really interested in those people and those scenes. You know, if we look, we find there's all sorts of glimpses of rural people sharing knowledge and doing stuff that is seen to be effective and good.
Wasn't herbal medicine, of course, the province of the monasteries
Yeah.
in the medieval age, and Shakespeare is referring to that surely in Romeo and Juliet with the friar.
Yeah, even after the dissolution of the monasteries, it was still a thing that priests did. I mean, everybody had some medical knowledge. Margaret Pelling has done some work on priest herbalists. One of my favorite actually is Vaughan, but quite a bit later in the 17th century, because he's a metaphysical poet, and was he? I think he was a priest as well. And he was a country doctor who escaped Cromwell's regime by disappearing into country Wales and rural Wales and administering medicine to local people. So he is precisely concerned with these questions about how to find God in nature and in plants in his poetry. Meanwhile, he's busy prescribing herbs to local people both as a medical man and as a religious man, a priest, or I can't remember if he was actually ordained. I think he was. But it continued to be something that was associated with theological, at least, if not some kind of sacramental practice. Yeah.
I've got one here from Paul Edmondson from the Birthplace Trust. Right. I'm wondering whether you can bring this dynamic between the sacramental, the pagan, the secular to today, when we seem to be suffering an attack from nature, and simultaneously we are seeking meaning through spiritual life ritual. Another way to put it, can art mediate our relationship with nature given the pandemic?
Oh, so relevant. It's a deep question. Can I speak on the pandemic? You say spiritual life ritual. Do you mean a contemporary search for some kind of spiritual ordering or spiritual practice that is disaffiliated from any established religious practice?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer
that. You can't answer.
It's question.
Yeah,
right,
so technology.
Yeah. But he said,
I think there is a lot to observe and to be concerned about and to question in this triangulation of established religious institutional practice, nature, and actually I think literature and art, because the latter two, nature and art, still hold a tremendous power over the imagination of a generation who do seem to be disaffiliating from observant religious practice. And I'm interested in how those 3 points can be connected up, as they seem to have been so much for the early modern period, and for Shakespeare in particular. I think it's good material for students to be thinking about, and they do get very interested, actually, and it's a good way for them to think about questions of divine immanence. I mean, it's I think they need to be reminded that in talking about nature, we are also talking about a created reality, that we belong to that created reality as well, and that all of that is so central to our understanding of early modern literature. But trying to make it relevant to contemporary literature can be tricky, because it seems to be draining away from that set of representative functions. So yeah, it's a big topic, and I think that there should be more conversation about it. But how it relates to the pandemic, I'm not sure. I feel very cut off from nature, stuck in my house.
Have you got a garden?
A small one. It's Cambridge. We've got small gardens. Yeah.
Okay. I got a question here from Molly Clark at Merton College in Oxford. And she's going to give a talk in a couple of weeks' time, I think, or 4 weeks' time in this series. Anyway, she says, thank you for such an interesting talk. The question is, do you think that the idea of immanence in objects pervades Cymbeline more generally? I'm thinking of Cloten's decapitated body, but wondering if you thought it was a broader theme.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. I have to say that tableau with the decapitated head is at the center of a really long chapter that I'm writing, and my poor students are submitted to a 2-hour lecture on that scene alone. I think it's amazing. There's so much going on. And in fact, I read it as a tapestry, because I think a lot of the again, this triangulation between divine immanence, the created world, and the mechanisms, the artistic mechanisms by which man can gain an allegorical understanding of immanence in created reality, is something that we see in tapestry depiction. And to me, that scene is a tapestry. So is the bedroom scene, incidentally. But yeah, Cymbeline as a whole, I think, is deeply infused with a lot of the I mean, we expect a kind of providential vision for the tragicomedies generally, but Cymbeline is usually acknowledged as the one that has the greatest degree of a providentialism that seems to be the most removed from the narrative and the action itself. So at various points through the dream in the prison, for instance, and through the various and the prophecy itself, we're being asked to trust or acknowledge that there is some quite strong providential force exerting itself on the narrative that is beyond the control of the players and the characters. And I think that we feel that in these highly emblematic moments as well. They seem excessively staged. Why is it so complicated? The amount of action that goes into creating that scene with the decapitated body and the flowers, because of course it was a funeral, 2 dead bodies being strewn with flowers that are very ornamentally described as replicas of the bodies. The brothers sing, and the whole thing is a huge funerary ritual. And then the body wakes up, and we go through this quite traumatic, blood-stained, grief-stricken realization. It's hugely complicated. And why did he go to that extent to create this moment? I mean, you know, he's worked so hard to make that emblem that I think we can't help but look at it and try and unpack all the various threads that are going on in the play as being sort of pulled at that moment. So yeah, it's a, you know, that scene.
Do you think Bonnie's trying to do too much in the play? You know, the kind of traditional issue about the play and its structure. I mean, you've got so many different structures of plays within a single play within Cymbeline. So, do you think he's struggling about this to try and get across the points that you're making, or the line that you're taking, and actually create a harmonious structure, a harmonious play, logical?
Oh, logical, no. Harmonious, I'm not sure. Yeah, there's too much going on. I mean, even at the syntactical level, I mean, people's language is too convoluted. There's too many plot points. There's too many characters. There's too many costume changes. The whole thing is excessive. There is an argument. I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was one of the directors of the productions at the National in the 80s. There was an argument that because at that point, yeah, everyone assumed that it was the first tragicomedy, and he was still sort of trying to work out what to do with the form. But someone put forward the case that actually potentially it's the final one, and it's the great realization of all the various strategies that he was developing through the late plays. Because although it's a bit over full, it nonetheless has a bit of everything in it, and like an opera, I don't know. It's.
I felt at times that he's gone to write a comedy, and he's using quite a lot of the structural elements from his comedies, but he starts to deliberately deconstruct it. See where we get. We start to deconstruct what he's kind of progressed to within his professionalism as a dramatist, and he just is trying to get underneath that.
Oh, right. So you're giving him the benefit there. He's not referring to himself. He's seeking to be humble in his references to himself, to undermine his own strategies. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to another one. Here's again, Paul. How far are Shakespeare's botanical moments original to his own imagination and knowledge of plants, and how far are they locatable within the iconography, allegory, and existing texts as Shakespeare's sources?
Yeah, so I have a real interest in Shakespeare's upbringing and his education, and it's hard to piece that picture together, obviously. Victorian readers were really interested in it as well, and it can be a nice thing to do, to go to the BOD or wherever your local legal depository library is, and find some Victorian books on Shakespeare's childhood, because they liked to offer a kind of biography of how he came to know so many plant species. He knows a lot. His imagination is deeply invested in the rural landscape. He knows a lot of plants. He knows precisely how they look in quite close-up detail. I mean, the comparison of Imogen's mole to the cowslip, the way that he builds that comparison, you have to be staring right inside the flower to see those 5 points. He knows a lot about rural games. So I think that his own childhood is deeply embedded in his use of natural imagery, plant imagery in particular, animals too, but really, if you count it up, the animals are barely there compared to the plants. The plants are a key system of image making for him. In terms of the local materials that he was reading, that's why I'm really interested in looking at what was being printed in those mid-century decades. Also, the other thing that we can't find, but which we assume was a huge influence, is the folklore that he would have been told. If we're going by the usual calculations that he was at home until he was 7 or 8 before going off to the grandma, you know, in those years, it was the women at home who were providing his education, and that semi-rural education would have been household work, animal law, kitchen physic, and the fields and the hedgerows. And combined with that, a kind of folkloric experience as well, which I think we can trace all through the plays. I mean, I do a lot of work with A Midsummer Night's Dream, and the way that the plant imagery is embedded there through folklore is great. And even, I mean, characters like the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, rustic, rural, garrulous women with stories to tell. You know, I mean, he actually has a lot of these, and I think they're the women that, you know, they're the rural domestic women from whom he learned about plants and heard all the standard stories. And that's the thing that we don't have in printed record. But so it can be tricky to try and describe it and use it in scholarship, but that's what I'm trying to do it, and I'm trying to do it through Shakespeare and through other anecdotes. And there are printed texts about Robin Goodfellow and other fairy figures, and Diane Purkis has done a lot of this work, so has Wendy Wall and Mary Ellen Lamb. But yeah, it's a picture that's just sort of whispering in the background of the plays.
Okay, this one's from Niall Kennedy. Did the early modern layman have more knowledge about the different varieties and significance of plants than his contemporary counterparts? If so, is this due to the plants' religious connections that you've talked about?
So layman there, non-religious or non-literate botanical, or non-medical. I'm going to, maybe the best thing to do, because I can't qualify the question, is to give a brief overview of what we get from scholars like Andrew Weir. I would really recommend that people read his great book on knowledge and practice in early modern medicine. It was a very complex medical world, and not even medical when it comes to botany. It was physic, we might say physic, but also knowledge of plants had other functions as well. It wasn't just physic. There were devotional, ornamental, pictorial functions, even just knowing your local landscape, stories, folklore. All of this is a kind of huge and complex system of knowledge about nature that everybody had. Yeah, I think everybody had some knowledge of plants. In this period in particular, botanical knowledge was accelerating very quickly. A number of scholars have called this period the Botanical Renaissance, and it's a system of knowledge that is available in some form to people from every social grouping. And the way that those groups interact with each other, I think, is a really interesting dynamic. At the very top of that sort of ladder, I suppose, we have the emergence of this new literate, institutionalized medical man who would go on to be the members of the Royal Society. And they're the people who are writing the botanical, encyclopedic botanical texts. They're the ones who are traveling around and compiling all the information in printed form. They've got opinions about those who use plants who are illiterate, for instance, but those opinions aren't actually always negative. The broader populace still really trusted local women, and in fact, the local women gathered the plants and brought them to market. So there were systems of dependency between learned medical men and illiterate rural women, both economic and kind of cultural. John Dee famously said, "You know, I don't trust you, medical men. My garden is my doctor, and my local herb woman. She's my apothecary." So it was a broad culture. There was also figures like the Queen, literate women who were able to read the printed herbals and also knew the local knowledge, who often set up proper pharmacies in their houses, making all sorts of medicines, from pills and poultices and everything, and providing it in a charitable capacity to the local area. So they kind of sat as interpreters between these two spheres of knowledge. So it was quite a complex landscape, really interesting landscape. But I think above and beyond the physic, people were just discovering plant species in a way that was also quite local and indigenous and nationalized. It was kind of part of a new sort of national project to discover the local English plants. I mean, the discovery might have been more on the part of literate writers, because illiterate rural people probably always knew, you know, the local landscape, but the local English species are being sort of discovered in a way that it's being written about in new surveys and new encyclopedic texts It's really great, wonderful stuff to read too, if you can get into the library and look at it, because each of these herbal books has a completely different theory about what a plant is and what we're supposed to be doing with it. And they all, yeah, sorry, that was a really long answer, but just to give you some enthusiasm to go and actually read these books in original, they're fabulous.
You really enthused us with all of that.
I spent too long reading early modern botanical manuscripts.
Yeah,
they're great.
But it reminds me of the people who at the moment trying all kinds of things to find out the cure for this, this pandemic that we've got, unfortunately. Actually, just following on from that and from your work on it, Niall also asks about your published articles and can he have access to it? But have you got things coming out at the moment on this?
On the botanical material, it's in monograph form. There's something on trees and forests in Renaissance drama, and there's something on Richard II and the garden scene and almanacs in a collection with Duquesne University Press called Soil Science in early modern or Renaissance, I think Renaissance Soil Science, which was edited by Hilary Eklund. That's a fabulous book, actually. It's really sad that Duquesne University Press has closed. The wonderful Frances Dolan is in that book. And there's a number of really great studies of the kind of Englishing of the soil. And I look at Richard II and almanac language in that book. I'd recommend that, yeah.
Well, Bonnie, thank you very much for a terrific talk. Fran, thank you for answering the questions so well. My apologies to anybody who I missed their question, but I hope I didn't in the end. This is the new technology for me as well. This is my first time doing it, but I've enjoyed doing it. I've enjoyed it very much. I'd like to also well, thank everybody who asked the question. Thank everybody who's been tuned into this. I'd like to thank Yvonne Crack and those working with her at Georgetown University, and also the technical company that has been working with her over this production tonight. Professor Catherine Temple at Georgetown for her participation behind the scenes. I hope I didn't make it too difficult for you, Catherine. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dr. Paul Edmondson of the Shakespeare Birthday Trust, Professor Lena Orlin of Georgetown University, Reverend Dr. Richard Finn, OP, and the Reverend Dr. David Goodhill of the Las Casas Institute and Blackfriars Hall for their support, and that also of Dr. Claire Bloom Saunders at Blackfriars. Dr. Yvette Curry is the joint coordinator of the series, and Kinga Rona Gabnai, the UK administrator of the series, and I'm very grateful to both of them. We couldn't do this without Georgetown University, and I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Jack DeJoya, the president, and Dr. Tom Banchoff, the vice president of global affairs, and Professor Chris Chalenza, the dean of the college at Georgetown University, for making it all happen. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for tonight's participation. Can I tell you what's coming up next? On the 19th of May, Dr. Andrew Moran, hello Andrew, I think you're listening to us tonight, of the University of Dallas, Texas, is going to talk on natural and supernatural happiness in the taming of the shrew. These talks are going to start at 4 p.m, not 8 p.m, they're 4 p.m, these talks. The first one, the 19th of May, Andrew Moran. Then on the 2nd of June, Molly Clark from Merton College, Oxford, is going to talk about Shakespeare and the morality plays, a formal heritage. And again, 4 o'clock, 2nd of June. Look forward to hearing that, Molly. Know you're there, out there somewhere, because you sent in a question. Thank you very much. And on the 16th of June, and this has only just been announced, we've got Professor John Drakakis from the University of Stirling, and he's going his usual alternative view on Shakespeare and Christianity, putting religion to the question, some reflections on Shakespeare's second tetralogy and his Venetian plays. And that will be rounding off the series for this academic year. So I hope you'll all be able to join us again in just a couple of weeks' time. And with that, I say good day, good night. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.